What if the most terrifying killer in history was never caught because he was never meant to be? In the fall of 1888, a shadow moved through the narrow alleyways of London's East End. It struck with surgical precision, vanished into the fog, and left behind silence, blood, and mystery. The name Jack the Ripper would come to define one of the most chilling unsolved cases in history. But who was he? A doctor? A butcher? A member of the royal family? Or something even more unexpected? Before we begin, if you enjoy thoughtful, slow-paced true crime stories designed to help you relax or focus, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and letting us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel, and your support truly helps us bring more of them to life. Now, take a breath, settle in, and let's return to Victorian London, a time of horse-drawn carts, flickering gas lamps, and secrets too dark for daylight. The year was 1888. Queen Victoria was on the throne, and the British Empire was the largest the world had ever seen. But while London's West End flourished with wealth and elegance, the East End told a very different story. Whitechapel, in particular, was a place of poverty, overpopulation and desperation. Narrow streets crammed with boarding houses, pubs and factories were filled with men and women barely scraping by. Many of the women were driven into prostitution just to afford a roof over their heads and a crust of bread. The area was bursting with people, immigrants, workers, beggars, and yet it remained invisible to the upper classes. Most of London saw Whitechapel as a place to avoid. To them it was a festering sore on the edge of an otherwise glorious city. Police presence was minimal, and most crimes went unnoticed, unsolved, or simply ignored. But that was about to change. In August of 1888, a 45-year-old woman named Mary Ann Nichols, known to friends as Polly, was found dead in Bucks Row, now called Durward Street. It was around 3:40 in the morning when a cart driver stumbled upon her body. At first glance, it looked like she'd simply passed out from drink, but as the police inspected her body more closely, a darker truth came to light. Her throat had been cut twice, all the way down to the vertebrae. Her abdomen was slashed open. There were signs of deliberate mutilation, brutal but precise. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted her dead, they wanted her to suffer, to be destroyed. The police were shaken. This wasn't an ordinary killing. It felt cold, clinical, almost like the killer had done it before, or planned to do it again. Less than a week later, the killer struck again. On September 8th, a woman named Annie Chapman was discovered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Like Polly Nichols, her throat had been cut, and her abdomen savagely mutilated. But this time, part of her internal organs were missing, removed with chilling skill. The killer had taken time, and had known exactly what they were doing. The newspapers pounced on the story. Horrible murder in Whitechapel. The headlines screamed. Suddenly, the East End was on everyone's mind, and everyone had a theory. The fear spread faster than the facts. People whispered that it had to be a doctor, or perhaps a slaughterhouse worker. Some claimed it was a member of the upper class preying on the poor. Others said it was a foreigner, playing into the xenophobia of the time. Meanwhile, the police were baffled. They interviewed countless suspects. They increased patrols, but the killer left no fingerprints, no clear witnesses, and no weapon. It was as though he simply appeared out of the fog, committed his terrible act, and vanished without a trace. And then, the letters began to arrive. On September 27th, a letter was delivered to the Central News Agency. It was addressed "Dear Boss," and it taunted the police, mocking their efforts to catch him. The writer claimed responsibility for the murders, and promised more to come. At the end, he signed it, Jack the Ripper. The name stuck. 2 days later, a postcard was sent, warning that another killing was imminent. That night, true to his word, 2 more women were murdered in what would become known as the double event. Elizabeth Stride was found first, her throat slashed in a dark yard off Berners Street. But there was something strange. Her body hadn't been mutilated like the others. Some believed the killer was interrupted before he could finish. Just 45 minutes later, across town, the killer struck again. Catherine Edo was found in Mitre Square, her body horribly mutilated, with parts of her face and organs removed. The city was in full panic now. The idea that someone could kill twice in one night, in different locations, and still escape unseen, was almost too much to bear. The press was relentless, the people were terrified, and the police, they were desperate. By this point, Scotland Yard had assigned one of their top detectives, Frederick Aberline, to the case. Aberline was no stranger to difficult investigations. He was experienced, calm and respected. But even he would struggle against the fog of uncertainty that surrounded this killer. The final confirmed victim, at least among what became known as the Canonical Five, was Mary Jane Kelly. She was just 25 years old, beautiful, and known for her kindness. On the morning of November 9th, 1888, her landlord sent someone to collect overdue rent. What they found was a scene of unimaginable horror. Mary Jane had been murdered in her own bed. Her face was mutilated beyond recognition. Her body was disemboweled, her organs scattered throughout the room. It was the most savage killing yet, and it happened indoors, which meant the killer had spent a long time with her body. And then, silence. Just like that, the murders stopped. No one knows why. Did the killer die? Was he imprisoned for a different crime? Did he leave the country? Or did he simply decide he'd had enough? The case remains one of the most baffling in history. Over 130 years later, no one has been conclusively identified as Jack the Ripper. Hundreds of suspects have been named: doctors, writers, royals, artists, even other killers, but none proven. As we continue this story, we'll walk through the key suspects, explore the theories, and examine the evidence left behind. We'll try to understand the world Jack the Ripper lived in, and the lives of the women whose names history too often forgets. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. 5 women, 5 lives cut short, and one of the greatest mysteries of all time. So, take another breath. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. We're just getting started. In the cold light of morning, the fog still hung over Whitechapel. Horse hooves clattered on cobblestones. Children shouted to one another on their way to run errands or scavenge coal. At a glance, life carried on as it always had. But under the surface, fear had taken hold. Something was different now. 5 women had been brutally murdered within a matter of weeks. Each one seemingly chosen at random. Each one left with wounds too deliberate to be mistaken for rage alone. This wasn't just crime. It was terror. And for many people living in the East End, especially women, every shadow, every footstep behind them in the dark felt like a warning. But the deeper you look into the story of Jack the Ripper, the more it becomes clear. This isn't just about a killer, it's about 5 women. Women who lived, struggled, laughed, suffered, and mattered. It's easy to let the killer dominate the narrative. That name, Jack the Ripper, has taken on an almost mythic quality. But the women he murdered weren't nameless victims. They were individuals, with stories of their own. And to truly understand this case, we must begin by honoring those stories. Mary Ann Nichols was born in 1845, the daughter of a locksmith. She grew up in relative stability, but married young to a printer. They had 5 children. Eventually the marriage broke down, and Polly, as she was known, began to drift through workhouses and lodging houses, often struggling with alcohol. She was 43 when her body was discovered on Bucks Row. Her life ended in silence before dawn. Annie Chapman, the second victim, had once lived a comfortable life. She was born in 1841, married to a coachman, and had 3 children. But one child died young, and Annie's health declined. She separated from her husband and found herself in Whitechapel, scraping by selling handmade items and odd bits. Like Polly, she battled alcoholism. She was last seen alive in the early hours of September 8th, asking for a place to sleep. By sunrise, she was gone. Elizabeth Stride's story was different. She was born in Sweden in 1843 and later moved to London, working for a time in a coffee shop and later as a domestic servant. She married, but the relationship crumbled. Elizabeth was known for her clean appearance and strong opinions. She was also known to exaggerate her past, claiming at one point that her husband and children had drowned on the Princess Alice, a tragic steamboat disaster. In truth, that story was likely invented, but it gives us a glimpse into a woman who craved sympathy, or perhaps simply wanted to be seen. Catherine Eddowes, often called Kate, was lively and intelligent. Born in Wolverhampton in 1842, she grew up in poverty after both her parents died. She lived with a partner and had several children, but they separated, and Kate ended up in Whitechapel. She earned money however she could, singing ballads, cleaning, selling trinkets. She was known for her wit and quick tongue. On the night she died, she had been taken into custody for drunkenness, and released later that night. Within an hour, she would become one of the Ripper's most mutilated victims. And finally, Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest of the five, and the only one murdered indoors. Mary's life is the most mysterious. She was said to be Irish, born in Limerick, or possibly Wales, and often spoke of time spent in Paris. Some said she had been a high-class escort before falling into poverty. Others said she'd been married, or lost a child. She was beautiful, artistic, and known to sing Irish ballads in a soft, haunting voice. Of all the victims, her murder was the most savage. Some believe it was personal, others believe the killer simply had more time. Either way, Mary Jane Kelly became the final name on the list of the so-called canonical five. There may have been other victims. Some were murdered before Mary Ann Nichols, others were found later, with similar wounds or circumstances. But these five share key similarities in their injuries, the locations, and the likely presence of a single killer. It's important to remember that all five women were labeled as prostitutes by the media and police at the time, but modern research has shown that's an oversimplification. Not all of them were selling sex. Some may have done so occasionally, some perhaps not at all. The label was often used to justify their deaths, to paint them as women whose choices had somehow invited violence. But this wasn't about morality. It wasn't about sex. This was about vulnerability. These women were poor. They were alone at night. They were sleeping in the streets, or in rented beds. They had few protections. That's what made them targets. And yet, each of them had people who loved them. Friends, lovers, children. They laughed, worked, hoped, they mattered. While London panicked, the police were under intense pressure to act. Scotland Yard assigned multiple detectives, including the now legendary Frederick Aberlin, a seasoned inspector. Aberlin knew the East End well. He walked the same streets, drank in the same pubs, spoke with the locals. He was methodical, respectful, and deeply committed to the case. Still, the investigation faced countless obstacles. There were no CCTV cameras, no DNA testing, no modern forensics. Even fingerprinting wasn't yet in use. The detectives were relying on eyewitness accounts, crude autopsies, and notes scribbled by gaslight. And yet, clues were there. Witnesses claimed to see strange men talking with the victims shortly before their deaths. Some described a man in a peaked cap. Others said he wore a deerstalker hat. Some mentioned a foreign accent. A few suggested he had blood on his hands or clothing. But the details were inconsistent. The fog of panic muddied everything. More than 2,000 people were interviewed. Over 300 suspects were investigated. But no one was arrested for the murders. Newspapers stirred the frenzy even more. Papers like the Pall Mall Gazette and the Star ran lurid headlines and published wild theories. It was around this time that the press began receiving letters. Some were hoaxes, cruel pranks written in blood-red ink, claiming to be from the killer. But one letter in particular stood out. The Dear Boss letter. It was dated September 25th and postmarked 2 days later. It was signed, for the first time, with the now infamous name Jack the Ripper. In calm handwriting, the letter mocked the police and described how the killer would clip the lady's ears off next time. That detail hadn't been released to the public yet. A few days later, Catherine Eddowes was found, her ear partly severed. Was the letter genuine, or was the author just lucky? No one knows for sure. Then came the saucy Jack postcard, and later the From Hell letter, arguably the most disturbing of all. It arrived with a small box containing half a human kidney, preserved in alcohol. The sender claimed to have eaten the other half. The handwriting was different, crude and shaky, but the message was chilling. Doctors confirmed the kidney was real, and likely from a woman of about Eddowes' age. Was it hers? Maybe, maybe not, but the police kept the letters, preserved the kidney, and filed them away. Over the next few years, Whitechapel remained tense. Though the murders had stopped, the fear lingered, and the legend of Jack the Ripper began to take on a life of its own. In our next part, we'll step deeper into the suspects, the names that have echoed across history, some ordinary, some infamous, some chillingly close to power. As we walk further down the foggy streets of 1888, we'll ask, did Jack the Ripper live among us in plain sight? Or was the truth buried long ago beneath the cobblestones of Whitechapel? The murders had stopped, but London was not at peace. The fog still drifted along the alleys of Whitechapel, curling like smoke from the city's very soul. Though Jack the Ripper seemed to have vanished as quickly as he appeared, the mystery of who he, or she was remained unsolved. Detectives were desperate for answers, journalists were hungry for names, and the public, terrified and fascinated in equal measure, began to imagine that anyone might be the killer, the butcher, the baker, the man next door. Suspicion clung to the East End like soot, and over time, a list of suspects began to emerge, some credible, some wildly speculative, all woven into the legend. Let's begin with one of the earliest and most persistent names, Montague John Druitt, a barrister and school teacher. Druitt was found drowned in the River Thames in December of 1888, just weeks after the last canonical murder. He came from a respectable family, but there were whispers of mental illness. Some even believed he took his own life out of guilt. The theory gained traction after a senior police official, Sir Melville Macnaghten, named Druitt as a strong suspect in a private memo. Macnaghten wrote that Druitt was sexually insane, though no evidence supported this. It was pure speculation, possibly fueled by the stigma of suicide. And yet the timing of Druitt's death, so close to the end of the killings, kept his name alive in Ripper lore. Then there was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish immigrant living in Whitechapel. He suffered from severe mental illness, and was eventually committed to an asylum. Kosminski displayed delusions, refused to bathe, and was known to wander the streets. Some modern theories point to him as the killer based on his proximity to the crimes and his erratic behavior. In 2014, a controversial claim surfaced that DNA taken from a shawl supposedly belonging to Catherine Eddowes matched one of Kosminski's descendants, but experts questioned the reliability of the testing and the authenticity of the shawl itself. After all, the item had passed through many hands, been handled without gloves, and may never have been at the crime scene to begin with. Still, Kosminski remains one of the most frequently discussed suspects to this day. Another prominent figure was Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born con man and thief with a long criminal record. He was known to use many aliases, and had been in and out of asylums. Macnaghten also listed him as a suspect, though no clear evidence connected him to the murders. His name, like many others, seemed to rest more on rumor and fear than fact. Then we come to George Chapman, born Severin Kowalski in Poland. Chapman was a barber surgeon, who later poisoned 3 of his wives. He was hanged for these murders in 1903. Some investigators noted that Chapman had lived in Whitechapel at the time of the Ripper murders, and had medical knowledge, something often attributed to the killer due to the nature of the wounds. But there's a problem. Chapman killed with poison, a method vastly different from the Ripper's brutal mutilations. Could he have changed tactics? Perhaps. But no concrete link was ever established. Now, let's turn to a more eccentric theory. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and grandson to Queen Victoria. Some believed that a secret love affair had led to a child born out of wedlock, and that members of the royal family had orchestrated the murders to cover it up. This elaborate theory, popularized in books and films, suggested that the victims had known about the child, and had to be silenced. It's a dramatic tale, but like many conspiracies, it lacks real evidence. Prince Albert wasn't even in London during several of the murders, and the idea of a royal conspiracy involving ritualistic killings simply doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Still, the theory persists, because it's mysterious, and because the human mind often seeks patterns, even when none exist. Another famous name, Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor, who traveled frequently and claimed to have treated high-profile patients. He was known for his strong misogynistic views, particularly toward women he called fallen. In fact, police did briefly arrest him in connection with the Ripper killings, though not for murder. He later fled to the United States. Tumblety was flamboyant, vain and bizarre, exactly the kind of figure who sparks suspicion. Some letters suggest Scotland Yard kept an eye on him even after he left England, but again, no definitive link was made. Still, others believe the killer wasn't a man at all. Some have proposed that a woman, a so-called Jill the Ripper, might have committed the crimes. A midwife, for instance, could have moved through the streets covered in blood without raising alarm. After all, Midwives were expected to have bloody aprons. The theory is intriguing, but lacks substantial evidence. Then there's James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton merchant, whose diary surfaced in the 1990s. The diary claimed he was Jack the Ripper, confessing in lurid detail to the murders, but handwriting experts and historians quickly pointed out discrepancies. The ink appeared modern. The diary was found under suspicious circumstances. Most consider it a hoax, but a compelling one. The list goes on. Over 100 names have been suggested, from local butchers to famous authors. Even Lewis Carroll, the writer of Alice in Wonderland, has been bizarrely proposed as the Ripper, based on cryptic word games in his poetry. It seems that everyone wants to solve the mystery, to find the face behind the shadow. But as more time passes, the truth grows dimmer. The lack of concrete forensic evidence means we may never know for certain, and in the absence of answers, the human imagination fills the void. What all these suspects share, whether credible or absurd, is a reflection of what frightened people at the time: foreigners, the mentally ill, the aristocracy, the unknown. In many ways, the suspect list tells us as much about Victorian London as it does about the killer himself. As we move forward, we'll explore the lives of the detectives who tried to stop him, the endless footwork, the sleepless nights, the growing frustration as each lead crumbled into dust. Because while Jack the Ripper remains a legend, those who hunted him were all too real, and so was their struggle. The fog had not lifted from the streets of Whitechapel, not in the days, weeks, or even years following the final canonical murder. While Jack the Ripper disappeared into history, those he left behind, the detectives, constables and ordinary people who were tasked with catching him, remained in a kind of suspended turmoil. They had walked those alleyways, sifted through bloody rags, questioned drunkards and dock workers, all in search of a ghost. And now, the ghost was gone. But in the quiet that followed the final killing, a new kind of noise began to fill the air: public frustration, media frenzy and official embarrassment. The Metropolitan Police, specifically Scotland Yard, came under intense scrutiny for their failure to solve the case. The commissioner at the time, Sir Charles Warren, had resigned just before the last murder. He was a former military man who believed in discipline, order and control, traits that did not always translate well to the unpredictable chaos of urban crime, especially one so strange and savage. Warren's methods were criticized, and his relationship with the press was particularly strained. He refused to share key information, believing it would jeopardize the investigation, but this only made the public more suspicious. Rumors flourished in the vacuum he left behind, and when Catherine Eddowes was murdered in Mitre Square, it was Warren who ordered the partial erasure of a chalked message found near the scene, writing that read, "The Joes are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The graffiti may have had no connection to the crime, but Warren feared it would ignite anti-Semitic riots, so he had it wiped away before it could be photographed. To this day, no one knows for sure what it meant, or if it meant anything at all. Other key figures in the investigation included Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, Inspector Frederick Aberline, and Dr. Thomas Bond. Swanson was methodical, intelligent, and deeply invested in solving the case. He kept detailed notes, including marginalia later found in the margins of his own copy of a book on the Ripper, notes that pointed to Aaron Kosminski as the likely culprit, at least in his view. Then there was Aberline, perhaps the most visible face of the investigation. He had previously worked undercover in Whitechapel, and knew the area well. Aberline was respected by his colleagues, and determined to bring the killer to justice. But the longer the case dragged on, the more theories and distractions clouded his path. Mediums came forward, offering visions. Cranks confessed. False leads multiplied. Aberline once reportedly said that he believed George Chapman, the barber who later poisoned his wives, may have been the Ripper. He wasn't sure though. None of them were. They were chasing shadows through smoke. Meanwhile, Dr. Thomas Bond, a surgeon working with the police, attempted something new for the time: a criminal profile. Based on the wounds and the locations, Bond concluded that the killer must have been a solitary man, subject to periodic attacks of mania. He doubted that Jack had any true surgical skill, despite the neatness of some incisions. Instead, he believed the killer had anatomical knowledge, perhaps gained through butchery,
rather than formal medical education. Bond's profile is now considered one of the earliest attempts at offender profiling in criminal history. Though primitive by modern standards, it was a thoughtful approach, and a glimpse into how the field of criminology would evolve in the decades to come. But even as Scotland Yard tried to refine its methods, it was at war with itself. There were jurisdictional disputes between the City of London Police and the Metropolitan Police, especially since Catherine Eddowes was murdered in an area that technically fell under the City Police's authority. They had their own detectives, their own theories, and their own rules. Information sharing was inconsistent. Territorialism bred confusion. Worse still, Parliament and the press demanded answers. Editorials accused the police of incompetence. Satirical cartoons mocked their efforts. Political opponents used the murders as ammunition. The idea that the world's most famous police force could not stop a killer roaming their capital was unthinkable. And yet it was the truth. A reward was eventually offered, not by the government, but by the Lord Mayor of London. The Home Office refused to provide one, fearing it would encourage false testimony. Still, private citizens raised money, including a group of local businessmen, who hired their own detectives to investigate independently. This kind of public involvement was unprecedented, and further muddied the waters. As the case continued to go cold, the letters kept arriving. We've already heard about the infamous Dear Boss letter, and the saucy Jackie postcard, but there were hundreds of others, some written in the same red ink, some scrawled with poor grammar, others with poetic flourishes. One letter, sent along with half a human kidney, claimed to be from the killer himself, saying the organ had been taken from Catherine Eddowes. Whether it was real or not, no one could say. The kidney did match her blood type, but in an era before DNA testing, that meant little. The public, however, was horrified and fascinated. Newspapers published the letters, sometimes embellishing them, sometimes forging new ones outright to boost sales. Jack the Ripper had become more than a murderer. He was now a character in an unfolding drama, written jointly by fear, speculation, and the hunger for spectacle. While the killer's identity remained elusive, the social questions he raised were not. Debates erupted about poverty, immigration, women's safety, and policing. The East End's condition could no longer be ignored. The killings had peeled back the curtain on a part of London that many would have preferred to forget. Organizations sprang up to improve conditions in Whitechapel. Housing reforms were discussed. Charities offered aid to sex workers. But much of this, sadly, was temporary. The slums were not transformed overnight. And while the case may have briefly drawn eyes to the plight of the poor, the systemic issues ran far deeper than any one investigation could fix. For the officers who spent months chasing the killer, there was no redemption. The case remained open in name only, with no arrests, no closure, and no satisfaction. Many of them went to their graves still haunted by the murders. Abberline, in his later years, gave interviews expressing regret, frustration, and fatigue. He had done everything he could, he said. It just wasn't enough. The story of Jack the Ripper is not just the story of a killer, it is also the story of failure, of how a system built to protect and serve struggled in the face of an evil it did not understand. The Ripper exposed the cracks in Victorian law enforcement, and left behind a case study in mystery, misdirection, and missed chances. As we continue, we'll turn our attention to the victims again, not just the 5 women whose names have become famous, but others whose deaths have raised questions. Was Jack the Ripper responsible for more murders than we know? Or has history, with all its whispers and shadows, confused truth with coincidence?
By the close of 1888, Whitechapel had returned to its uneasy rhythm. The fear hadn't fully lifted. People still looked over their shoulders, especially on quiet streets and in shadowy corners. But the terror that once clenched the entire East End had softened into a dull ache. It was as though the city had absorbed the horror, and in doing so learned to live alongside it. But questions lingered. Not only about the identity of the killer, but also about the scope of his crimes. Most people today know the canonical 5, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. But during the actual investigation, police weren't so sure the number ended there. To understand this, we have to go back, not forward, to the months leading up to August 1888. Because the truth is, women were dying in Whitechapel long before the world began paying attention. One such case was that of Emma Elizabeth Smith. On April 3, 1888, Smith was attacked on the street and later died in the hospital from her injuries. Unlike the canonical victims, she wasn't mutilated in the same way. Instead, she had been beaten and assaulted, possibly by more than one person. Before she died, she described her attackers as a gang of young men. This doesn't quite fit the profile of Jack the Ripper as we've come to understand it. But at the time, the police couldn't be sure. Emma Smith's death was noted in early police files as a possible precursor to the Ripper killings. Was she an early victim, or simply another woman caught in the brutal tide of Whitechapel's violence? Then there was Martha Tabram. She was found dead on August 7, 1888, just a few weeks before Mary Ann Nichols. Tabram had been stabbed 39 times in a stairwell of George Yard buildings. The frenzy of the attack was shocking, even by Whitechapel standards. Yet there was one major difference. Tabram's wounds were puncture wounds, not slashes. The killer had used a small knife or dagger, not the surgical blade or long knife thought to be Jack's weapon of choice. Still, Martha's death seemed so similar in its savagery that Inspector Aberline initially considered her the first Ripper victim. Over time, opinions shifted. Most modern historians exclude her from the canonical five, but some continue to argue that she was the killer's first act, an early unrefined strike before his method became fully developed. If we accept Martha Tabram as a possible victim, the timeline of Jack the Ripper changes. It pushes the beginning of his spree further back, suggesting he may have experimented before settling into his gruesome routine. And if that's true, then perhaps there are even more unknown victims buried in the margins of Whitechapel's violent past. There were certainly other suspicious deaths. Some women were found dead with unusual injuries. Others disappeared entirely. But the chaos of the East End, its constant turnover, its poverty, and the way people vanished without consequence, makes it nearly impossible to separate the Ripper's work from the everyday brutality of the slums. One case that has baffled historians is that of Frances Coles. She was found murdered on February 13, 1891, over 2 years after the last canonical killing. Her throat had been cut, but her body hadn't been mutilated. Some believed the killer had been interrupted. A man named James Sadler, who had been seen with Coles shortly before her death, was arrested and charged. But the case against him fell apart. He was released, and the murder remains unsolved. Was Coles another Ripper victim, or a tragic coincidence? The uncertainty never went away. What's most revealing about these disputed cases is what they tell us about the climate of the time. Jack the Ripper didn't just kill women. He created an environment in which all violent deaths became suspect. Every murder after 1888 was filtered through the lens of his crimes. If a woman was found dead in Whitechapel, people wondered if the Ripper had returned. If a man acted strangely in the street, someone might whisper that he looked like Jack. The effect was corrosive. It destabilized trust and heightened paranoia. Even the police became more cautious, more likely to overreact to a potential threat, or dismiss something that didn't fit the established pattern. They were chasing a phantom, and in doing so found themselves haunted by his possible echoes. In this atmosphere, profiling Jack the Ripper became more art than science. With each new possible victim, the image of the killer shifted slightly. Was he escalating, backsliding, playing a different game altogether? Or had someone else, perhaps an opportunist or copycat, taken inspiration from the legend? It's worth noting that the concept of a copycat killer was not well understood at the time. The term didn't even exist yet. But the idea that one killer's infamy could inspire others is now a well-known phenomenon. And Jack the Ripper was tragically the perfect model. He was mysterious, successful in eluding capture, and the subject of endless media fascination. Some even speculated that the Ripper was never just one person, that the canonical five weren't killed by the same hand. This theory, while not widely accepted, persists in some circles. The differences in location, mutilation style, and even victim choice have been used to support the idea that more than one killer was at work, perhaps taking advantage of the panic to conceal their own crimes. Then again, others argue the opposite, that the Ripper killed more than just the five. and perhaps many more. In this view, the canonical five are simply the ones we know for sure, while the full list of victims stretches out, blurry and incomplete, across the gas-lit streets of London. Modern investigations, often carried out by amateur sleuths, authors, or retired detectives, have tried to bring clarity. Some use new techniques like geographic profiling, mapping the locations of each crime to predict where the killer might have lived or worked. Others study linguistic patterns in the Ripper letters, hoping to reveal a name. Still others go back to forensic evidence, though most of it has long since degraded or vanished. Despite their best efforts, the true body count of Jack the Ripper remains unknown. And maybe that's part of the reason the story endures. If the mystery had been neatly solved, the Ripper would have faded into history like so many other killers. But the gaps in knowledge, the missing names, the unconfirmed victims, the unanswered questions, are what keep people coming back. Each unsolved death in Whitechapel from that era is like a match held to dry kindling. One spark, and the fire of speculation reignites. So what do we make of it all? A serial killer with only 5 victims is already terrifying. But if we open the door to more, if we believe that the Ripper killed 7, or 10, or even a dozen women, then the scale of his crimes becomes even more disturbing. And yet, even as we tally the bodies, we must not forget the lives. Each woman, canonical or not, had a story. A childhood, hopes. People who cared for them, however distantly. They weren't just footnotes in a mystery. They were human beings. As we continue, we'll step into the shadows of speculation and follow the theories that have tried to unmask the man behind the name. Over 100 years of suspects, hoaxes, and alleged confessions, all circling a name the world has never stopped whispering. In the hush that followed the final murder, attributed to Jack the Ripper, London did not rest easy. There was no public declaration of victory, no satisfying arrest, no courtroom drama to mark the end of the nightmare. The murders simply stopped. And into that silence crept something almost worse than fear, curiosity. With time, the need to understand replaced the urge to flee. People wanted to know who Jack the Ripper had been. They wanted closure, a name, a face, a reason. And so began one of the longest-running whodunits in modern history. A parade of suspects, some reasonable, some completely absurd, emerged in the wake of the killings. Newspapers, authors, even retired detectives, added their theories to the mix, each hoping to solve the mystery once and for all. Let's begin with one of the earliest and most well-known suspects, Montague John Druitt. Druitt was a barrister and schoolteacher who lived not far from Whitechapel. He was reportedly intelligent and well-spoken, but suffered from mental health issues. In December 1888, about a month after the last of the canonical murders, Druitt's body was pulled from the River Thames. It was ruled a suicide. What made Druitt suspicious was the timing of his death. Shortly after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, considered by many to be the final Ripper killing, Druitt vanished. When his body was found, it raised eyebrows. Some thought he may have taken his own life out of guilt. Others believed the sudden stop in killings after his disappearance was no coincidence. Even Inspector McNaughton, of Scotland Yard, mentioned Druitt in a confidential memo, suggesting he had strong evidence pointing to Druitt as the likely killer, but no concrete proof ever surfaced. Druitt had no known history of violence, and no one could place him near any of the crime scenes. Was he simply a troubled man who met a tragic end? Or was his death the final act of a tormented murderer? Then there was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish immigrant, living in Whitechapel. Kosminski suffered from schizophrenia, and was eventually committed to an asylum, where he lived out the rest of his life. At the time of the murders, he was known to local police, and had a reputation for erratic behavior, and an intense hatred of women. He was named by several senior officers, including Assistant Commissioner Sir Robert Anderson, as a prime suspect. Anderson even claimed that a witness had identified Kosminski as the killer, but had refused to testify, possibly due to fear or social pressure. In more recent years, Kosminski gained renewed attention when a piece of shawl allegedly recovered from a Ripper crime scene was said to contain DNA linking him to Catherine Eddowes, one of the canonical victims.
However, that evidence has been widely criticized. The shawl's provenance is questionable, and the DNA testing methods used were not independently verified. Still, for many, the combination of contemporary suspicion and modern science makes Kosminski one of the most compelling suspects. He was in the right place, at the right time, with the right background to have slipped through the cracks of a chaotic investigation. Another popular theory involves Dr. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor who spent time in London in 1888. Tumblety was known for his strange behavior and grandiose claims. He was also deeply misogynistic, reportedly keeping a collection of female reproductive organs in jars. Tumblety was arrested in London around the time of the murders for unrelated offences, including gross indecency, and fled back to the United States after being released on bail. Some believe he was fleeing more than just the charges. His bizarre habits and proximity to the crimes have made him a recurring character in Ripper lore. Yet, as with the others, hard evidence is lacking. Tumblety was never directly linked to any of the victims, and no eyewitness ever identified him. One of the most sensational suspects was Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, and a grandson of Queen Victoria. This theory, largely pushed by conspiracy-minded authors in the 20th century, suggests that Prince Albert had either gone mad or fathered an illegitimate child with a commoner. In both scenarios, royal agents are said to have committed the murders to cover up the scandal. It's a juicy story, full of secret societies, forbidden romance, and regal intrigue. But there's very little factual basis for it. Records place Prince Albert away from London during some of the murders, and there's no credible evidence connecting him to the crimes. Still, the theory persists, because it's just mysterious enough, just dramatic enough, to capture imaginations. Some have even proposed women as possible suspects. Most notably, Mary Piercy, a woman convicted in 1890 of murdering her lover's wife and child in a particularly brutal manner. Some writers have suggested that Piercy's rage and violent tendencies could fit the Ripper profile, and that she might have disguised herself as a man to commit the Whitechapel murders. Again, the evidence is thin. There's no proof Piercy was in the area during the killings, but the idea that Jack the Ripper might have been a Jill, slipping through the fog in a dress and bonnet, remains one of the more unusual yet strangely plausible theories. The list doesn't stop there. It includes artists like Walter Sickert, who some believe encoded clues to the murders in his paintings, and Lewis Carroll, author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, has even been accused based on anagrams pulled from his poetry. These theories, while often creative, tend to stretch the bounds of credibility. What's perhaps most fascinating is how the suspect list reflects the era's fears. Immigrants, aristocrats, mentally ill individuals, foreigners, and even beloved cultural figures. Each theory reveals something about the anxieties of the time, and the ongoing search for meaning in chaos. As the years passed and memories faded, the Ripper became less of a man, and more of a myth. The longer he went unidentified, the more he transformed into a symbol of mystery, of horror, of the unknown lurking just beyond the gaslight. It also reveals something about human nature. We are creatures who seek stories. We want our monsters to have names, our puzzles to have solutions. An open-ended mystery nags at the brain. And the Jack the Ripper case is the ultimate open loop. Every generation seems to produce its own Ripper theorists. They dig into old files, chase shadows, and revisit long cold clues. Some genuinely hope to solve the case. Others seem to enjoy the chase more than the destination. Despite advances in forensic science and the digitization of old records, the case remains frustratingly opaque. Every breakthrough is met with skepticism. Every new theory is followed by a debunking. The truth, if it still exists somewhere, remains tangled in lost evidence, missing files, and the fog of history. But one thing has become clear. Whoever Jack the Ripper was, he changed more than just the lives he took. He changed the way the world thinks about crime. He sparked one of the first media frenzies. He exposed the gaps in 19th century policing, and he ignited a fascination with serial killers that still echoes today. In the next section, we'll step into the darker corners of the Ripper legend, exploring the psychological profile of the killer. What kind of person commits such crimes, and then vanishes without a trace? And why did the killings stop? The fog of London hung heavy in the air as 1888 slipped into memory. The fear that once clutched the city began to slowly loosen its grip. But an uncomfortable question remained: why did Jack the Ripper stop? There are few things more unsettling than a murderer who walks away. No arrest, no trial, no confession. One day, the killings just ended. It left the world not with relief, but with lingering doubt. Many have tried to explain this abrupt silence by examining the killer's psychology. What kind of person could commit such horrific acts and then vanish, seemingly without consequence or trace? To understand that, we need to explore the mind of a serial killer, at least as we understand it today. Keep in mind, this field was virtually non-existent in 1888. The term serial killer hadn't even been coined yet. In fact, it wouldn't become common language until nearly a century later, during the rise of behavioral profiling in the FBI. But modern psychology gives us tools that help us look backward. A killer like Jack the Ripper fits what many criminologists call the organized-disorganized model. Organized killers tend to plan their crimes, choose specific victims, and take steps to avoid detection. Disorganized killers act more impulsively. Their crimes are chaotic, often carried out in moments of extreme emotion or delusion. Jack the Ripper sits somewhere in between. On one hand, his murders showed a shocking level of brutality and frenzy, suggesting an unstable mind. But on the other hand, he left remarkably few clues behind. He committed multiple murders in public areas, yet managed to escape unseen every time. That suggests planning, control, and an awareness of risk. He knew how to avoid attention in one of the most watched and paranoid districts in London. The mutilations also tell a story. They weren't random, they showed knowledge of anatomy, at least to some degree. Many believe the killer had medical training, or at least worked in a profession that exposed him to the human body. Slaughterhouse workers, medical students and mortuary assistants all came under suspicion. But more important than the how, is the why. Why would someone do this? One prevailing theory is that Jack the Ripper was driven by a hatred of women, especially sex workers. His attacks were not just killings, they were expressions of rage. The disfigurement of his victims, the removal of body parts, the deliberate targeting of women on the margins of society, it all suggests deep-seated misogyny, likely fueled by psychological trauma or mental illness. Perhaps he felt powerless in other areas of his life, and the murders gave him a sick sense of control. Or perhaps he was trying to make a statement, a twisted form of moral or religious crusade, against what he saw as immoral behavior. These are only theories, of course. Without knowing who he was, we can only guess what haunted his mind. So why did he stop? There are several possible explanations. One is death. Maybe he died before he could kill again. This aligns with the theory about Montague Druitt, the barrister who took his own life shortly after the last murder. If the Ripper was indeed Druitt, or someone else who met a sudden end, that could explain the abrupt silence. Another possibility is incarceration. The killer may have been arrested for an unrelated crime. In those days, people were routinely imprisoned for theft, assault, or even homelessness. It's conceivable that Jack the Ripper simply disappeared into the prison system, unnoticed. Some believe he may have been institutionalized. If he had a mental breakdown or began acting erratically, he could have been committed to an asylum. Several suspects, including Aaron Kosminski, were eventually confined to mental institutions. Once removed from society, his violent urges would have no outlet. There's also the chance that he left London, or even the country. With no modern systems of identification or tracking, he could have boarded a ship, started a new life elsewhere, and continued his crimes in a new city. In fact, some unsolved murders in places like New York and Chicago around that time have been speculatively linked to the Ripper. But there's a darker possibility still. What if he simply chose to stop? That's a chilling thought, because it suggests he wasn't out of control. He wasn't consumed by a compulsion he couldn't resist. He was methodical, deliberate, and when it no longer suited him, he walked away. This idea has disturbed many criminologists and writers. It removes the comfort of madness. If the Ripper was a lunatic, a deranged mind unraveling in the gaslit alleys of Whitechapel, then we can tell ourselves there was no rhyme or reason. But if he was calculating, if he stopped because he'd accomplished what he wanted, that makes him something else entirely. It makes him a predator. Another piece of this mystery lies in public attention. After the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, in November 1888, the press reached a fever pitch. The city was boiling with panic. The police were under fire. Vigilante groups were patrolling the streets. It's possible the killer realized he was getting too close to exposure. The risk was growing. The streets were no longer quiet and dark. They were loud, suspicious, and crawling with constables. Maybe he felt the pressure and decided to stop before he got caught. There's also the question of letters. During the height of the murders, the press and police received a deluge of correspondence. Some were hoaxes. Some were written in red ink, or real blood, claiming to be from the killer. The most famous, the Dear Boss letter, is where the name Jack the Ripper first appeared. Was it really him writing those letters? Or was it just someone trying to stoke the flames? If the letters were from the killer, they offer a rare glimpse into his mind. They're taunting, theatrical, and disturbingly playful. He refers to himself with eerie detachment, even humor. But again, we face a wall of uncertainty. Handwriting analysis at the time was rudimentary. Many believed the letters were the work of journalists, hoping to boost circulation. Without knowing who he was, we can't say for sure what ended his spree. But the stopping point remains one of the most crucial and haunting details of the case, because it raises a final terrifying question: did he stop? Or did he simply change? Could Jack the Ripper have evolved? Could he have found new ways to hurt, new targets to hunt, or even new cities to haunt? The killings attributed to him were so specific, so grotesque, that it's hard to imagine him giving it up cold. And yet no similar murders occurred in London again. Not with the same style. Not with the same signature. It's possible he found other quieter ways to destroy. Not all killers use knives. Still, the silence that followed his last known murder has become as much a part of the legend as the crimes themselves. It's the ending with no ending. The curtain that falls with no applause, no resolution. And so the mystery grew, from the cobbled streets of Whitechapel, to drawing rooms, police academies, university halls, and now countless screens and podcasts around the world. The story of Jack the Ripper endures not just because of what he did, but because of what we'll never know. In our next section, we'll delve deeper into the impact of the murders, how they shaped the public consciousness, influenced popular culture, and changed the way society viewed crime, safety, and the very idea of evil. As the murders ceased, and Jack the Ripper vanished from the streets of Whitechapel, the city of London was left not with relief, but with questions. Who had he been? Why had he chosen his victims? And perhaps most haunting of all, what was the true cost of what he'd left behind? Because while the killings had stopped, the damage endured. The impact of Jack the Ripper's crimes rippled outward in every direction, across the police force, the press, the city's social classes, and even into the cultural imagination of generations to come. He had shaken not just the East End, but the very soul of Victorian England. What followed wasn't peace, it was transformation. To understand the aftermath, we must first return to the heart of the Ripper's hunting ground, Whitechapel. Even before the murders, it was an area already under strain, overcrowded, impoverished, and neglected by the powers that be. Whitechapel had long symbolized the deep divide between London's glittering wealth and grinding poverty. But the killings changed the way outsiders saw it, and the way those within it saw themselves. In the months after Mary Jane Kelly's death, journalists descended on Whitechapel like moths to a flame. Newspaper headlines painted the district in terms of darkness, vice, and hopelessness. Articles depicted its residents as either victims or degenerates. There was little room for complexity. The press had found its villain, and its stage. The effect was twofold. On one hand, it drew national attention to the social ills plaguing the East End. On the other, it deepened the stigma attached to its people, especially its women. Sex workers, already living precariously on the fringes, became both mourned and blamed. The public, politicians and clergy debated their role in society. Were they deserving of protection, or were they symbols of moral decay? It was a conversation steeped in judgment. Several charitable missions and reform groups tried to seize the moment, using the murders as justification to clean up Whitechapel. Some efforts were genuinely intended to help. Others were more about optics, efforts to appease public outcry, rather than address root causes. Meanwhile, the Metropolitan Police, specifically Scotland Yard, found itself under siege. Public confidence in the police plummeted. How could a killer strike 5, 6, maybe even more times in crowded urban streets without being caught? Why were there no arrests? No convictions? Had the police failed? Or were they simply outmatched? Sir Charles Warren, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police during the height of the investigation, resigned amid intense criticism. His leadership had been contentious even before the murders, but the Ripper case magnified every misstep. His handling of evidence, particularly the controversial decision to erase the Galston Street graffiti, was a turning point. That chalk message, found scrawled near a piece of Catherine Eddowes' bloody apron, read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Was it a genuine clue? A red herring? Anti-Semitic vandalism? To this day no one knows. But Warren, fearing a riot, ordered it removed before it could be photographed. His decision remains one of the most debated actions in the case's history. Internally, the investigation strained the police force to its limits. Hundreds of officers were mobilized. Dozens of suspects were questioned. Rewards were offered. Informants were paid. And yet, nothing. The failure to capture the Ripper would haunt British policing for decades. It exposed the limitations of the time. No fingerprinting, no criminal databases, no reliable forensic science. But it also inspired innovation. In the years that followed, new efforts emerged to professionalize detection, criminal profiling, crime scene preservation, and interagency communication all became subjects of growing interest. While Jack the Ripper was never caught, his legacy helped lay the foundation for modern criminology. And then there's the role of the media. The Ripper case is often cited as one of the first true media frenzies. With newspapers in fierce competition for readership, editors quickly realized that the Whitechapel murders sold papers like nothing else. Stories became increasingly sensational, headlines more lurid. Journalists competed for the most gruesome details. Some went so far as to fabricate letters from the killer, like the infamous Dear Boss letter, and the even bloodier From Hell letter, which arrived alongside a small box containing a human kidney. The line between fact and fiction blurred. It's difficult to overstate how much this press coverage shaped public understanding of the case. Even today, many of the facts we accept about Jack the Ripper come not from police reports, but from newspaper accounts that may have been exaggerated, misunderstood, or invented entirely. The media's influence also helped turn Jack the Ripper into something more than a killer. He became a myth, a symbol, even a character. Stage plays were written, penny dreadfuls, cheap serialized horror stories, used his name to sell copies. Wax figures of the Ripper appeared in Madame Tussauds. Later, films and novels would portray him in every form imaginable. A mad doctor, a nobleman by day, a monster by night. He became a canvas, onto which society projected its fears. Over time, Jack the Ripper became less about the real man, and more about what he represented. The fear of the unknown. The fragility of safety. The idea that evil could walk among us unnoticed. For some, he became an argument for social reform. For others, a cautionary tale about urban decay and moral failure. But for the families of the victims, there was no metaphor, only loss. It's important not to lose sight of that. The women killed by Jack the Ripper were real people, with lives, struggles, and humanity. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. Each had a story. They were not merely fallen women. They were daughters, mothers, wives. Some had turned to prostitution out of desperation. Some lived with chronic illness or addiction. Others simply ran out of options. Their stories deserve to be told, not just as victims of a monster, but as individuals who mattered. In some ways, it's their humanity that has kept this case alive for so long. We remember the Ripper, because we cannot forget them. In modern times, the fascination with Jack the Ripper has only grown. New suspects are named every year. DNA evidence, though often inconclusive or disputed, brings fresh hope and controversy. Books, documentaries, and internet forums continue to speculate.
But perhaps that's part of the enduring allure, a mystery that resists closure, a story with enough shadows to keep the imagination running wild. As we move forward in this story, we'll examine some of the key suspects, the men who for one reason or another have been accused of being Jack the Ripper. We'll look at their lives, their possible motives, and the evidence for and against them. From troubled physicians to eccentric artists, from Polish immigrants to royal conspiracies, the suspect list is long, varied, and endlessly intriguing. And maybe, just maybe, we'll get closer to the truth. With the dust beginning to settle over Whitechapel and the final confirmed victim, Mary Jane Kelly, laid to rest, the attention of the public, the press, and the police turned from panic to pursuit. The killer had stopped, or so it seemed. But that only deepened the mystery. Who was Jack the Ripper? Speculation swirled. Every week brought new theories, new names, and new suspects. Some were grounded in evidence, others in rumor, but all shared one thing in common. They reflected a society grasping for answers in the face of something unknowable. The suspect list was, and remains, long. But a few names have stood out over time, individuals who through circumstance, behavior, or coincidence, captured the imagination of investigators and the public alike. In this part, we'll begin exploring some of the most prominent suspects, starting with one of the earliest and most persistent, Montague John Druitt. Montague Druitt was in many ways an unlikely suspect. A barrister and schoolteacher from a respectable background, he lived a seemingly ordinary life. But there were shadows under the surface. Druitt's connection to the Ripper case came not through hard evidence, but through timing and implication. In December 1888, just a few weeks after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, Druitt's body was pulled from the River Thames. His pockets were filled with stones, and the coroner ruled it a suicide. A note left behind suggested a mental breakdown. His family, it seemed, had grown increasingly concerned about his behavior in the weeks leading up to his death. At the time, this was only loosely linked to the murders. But several months later, a senior officer in the Metropolitan Police, Sir Melville Macnaghten, named Druitt as a strong suspect in a private memorandum. According to Macnaghten, Druitt was a doctor, although he wasn't. He was likely confused with someone else. Macnaghten believed Druitt had suffered from sexual insanity, and that his death shortly after the final murder was no coincidence. Druitt's name stuck. The case against him was circumstantial. He was never arrested. He left behind no written confession. There's no physical evidence tying him to the crimes, but his apparent mental decline, the timing of his suicide, and the fact that he had no alibi for the key nights kept him on the radar. In many ways, Druitt became the template for the disturbed gentleman suspect, a man of education and means, hiding monstrous impulses behind a respectable facade. But there were other names, grittier, closer to the East End itself. One such figure was Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski was a Polish Jewish immigrant who lived in Whitechapel and worked sporadically as a barber. He suffered from severe mental illness, most likely paranoid schizophrenia, and was committed to an asylum not long after the murders ceased. In 1894, another police official, Assistant Commissioner Sir Robert Anderson, wrote in his memoirs that the Ripper had been a low-class Polish Jew who had been positively identified by a witness, but that the witness refused to testify in court. While Anderson never named Kosminski directly, many believe he was the man in question. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, who worked on the case, later scribbled marginal notes in a copy of Anderson's memoirs, stating that the suspect was Kosminski, and that he had been identified by a witness, possibly Joseph Llewellyn, yet no prosecution followed. Kosminski's name gained further traction in the 21st century when a controversial book claimed that mitochondrial DNA found on a shawl at one of the crime scenes matched a descendant of Kosminski. But this evidence has been widely disputed. Some experts say the shawl was contaminated. Others question the provenance of the item entirely. What we do know is that Kosminski was known to police at the time, had a history of delusions and violent tendencies, and lived very near to where the murders occurred. But he was also severely mentally ill, delusional, paranoid, and largely incoherent during his time in the asylum. Could he have planned and executed such precise killings? Some argue yes, others remain unconvinced. Another compelling suspect was Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born conman and thief. He was known for his use of multiple aliases, and claimed to be a surgeon in the Russian Navy. His criminal record was extensive, mostly for fraud and theft, but some believed he had the skills and cold temperament necessary to commit the Ripper murders. Ostrog was named in the same McNaughton memorandum that included Druitt. However, later research revealed that Ostrog was likely incarcerated in France during at least some of the Whitechapel murders, weakening the case against him considerably. Still, his slippery identity and mysterious background captured the imagination. Then there's Dr. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor with a flair for showmanship and a deep loathing for women, particularly sex workers. Tumblety was in London during the murders and was arrested in November 1888 for unrelated offences, including charges related to homosexual activities, which were illegal at the time. Soon after, he fled to France and then back to the United States. While Tumblety was never officially charged in connection with the Ripper murders, police monitored his movements, and several investigators considered him a person of interest. His misogynistic writings and suspicious behavior added fuel to the fire. And yet, like so many others, the case against him was speculative. As we sift through these suspects, a pattern emerges. The men accused of being Jack the Ripper often reflected the fears and biases of the time. Foreigners, Jews, homosexuals, mentally ill individuals, people who were seen as outsiders or somehow threatening to the Victorian status quo. The Ripper case, then, wasn't just a murder mystery. It became a mirror, reflecting the anxieties, prejudices, and tensions of an empire at its peak, and a city on the edge. But of course, not every theory relied on known criminals or marginalized individuals. As we'll explore in the next part, some suspected the Ripper was someone powerful, perhaps even royal, a figure who could kill and escape with impunity. A man so protected by status that the truth had to be buried. These theories may seem far-fetched, and in many cases, they are, but they speak to the vacuum at the heart of the mystery. When evil goes unpunished, the imagination fills in the blanks. As the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, the mystery of Jack the Ripper began to drift further from immediate memory and deeper into myth. And with that shift, the nature of the theories surrounding the case began to change as well. The early suspects, local madmen, misfits and troubled individuals, were still considered, of course. But in time, a more dramatic and conspiratorial line of thinking took root. What if Jack the Ripper hadn't been some unknown lone skulking through the shadows of Whitechapel? What if he had been someone with power, with wealth, with friends in high places? Someone, perhaps, so powerful that the truth had to be hidden. And so, the royal conspiracy theories were born. At the heart of these theories was a single compelling idea that Jack the Ripper was part of, or connected to, the British royal family. Some versions of the theory claimed that a royal was the killer. Others suggested the killer was a servant acting on royal orders. All shared one core belief, that the police knew more than they let on, and that a cover-up had taken place. The most famous version of this theory centers on Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale. Prince Albert Victor, or Eddie, as he was known to his family, was the eldest son of Edward VII and the grandson of Queen Victoria. He was second in line to the British throne. Eddie was not a strong or commanding figure. By most historical accounts, he was quiet, passive, and intellectually limited. But in the decades following the Ripper murders, his name became attached to the case in increasingly elaborate and sinister ways. The most well-known version of this theory
was popularized in the 1970s and 1980s by authors like Stephen Knight. Knight's 1976 book, Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, put forward a complex narrative that blended royal scandal, secret marriages, and Freemasonry. According to Knight, Prince Albert Victor had secretly married a Catholic commoner named Annie Crook and fathered her child. This supposed marriage, if proven, would have been politically explosive. Not only because Eddie was a royal, but because Catholicism was still viewed with suspicion in Protestant England. The theory claimed that Queen Victoria, upon discovering the marriage and the child, ordered her trusted physician, Sir William Gull, to eliminate the women who knew the secret. These women, allegedly, were the Ripper's victims. To carry out the murders, Gull was said to have used his medical knowledge, with the help of a coachman and a royal accomplice, to dispatch the women in ritualistic killings that reflected Masonic symbolism. It sounds sensational, and it is. Historians have found no credible evidence that Prince Albert Victor was ever married, secretly or otherwise. Nor was he known to be in Whitechapel at the time of the murders. In fact, he had alibis placing him in other cities during key dates. Likewise, there's no historical record of Annie Crook or her supposed child. As for Sir William Gull, he was an elderly and ailing man at the time of the killings, nearly 70 years old, and recovering from a stroke. The idea that he galloped through Whitechapel's alleys in the dead of night, dissecting victims by lantern light, seems highly unlikely. Yet despite its factual problems, the royal theory endured. Why? Part of its appeal lies in its drama. It's a story of forbidden love, secret births, royal corruption, and elite societies. It paints the murders not as the work of a madman, but as a cold, calculated cover-up. It makes the mystery even bigger. And perhaps most importantly, it gives a satisfying explanation for why Jack the Ripper was never caught, because someone powerful didn't want him to be. This idea, that the killer was protected, resonates with many people. It speaks to a deep distrust in authority, one that existed even in the 19th century. The East End was used to being neglected, overlooked, and mistreated by the government. Was it so hard to believe that justice had been denied to them again, this time at the hands of the elite? Over time, the royal theory morphed and multiplied. Some versions suggested that Prince Albert Victor himself was the Ripper, driven mad by syphilis or secret trauma. Others proposed that he had participated in the murders as part of some bizarre Masonic ritual. A few even claimed that the royal family had him quietly institutionalized or killed to prevent the truth from leaking. These theories often relied on a web of circumstantial connections, misinterpreted documents, and hearsay passed down through decades. For some, that was enough. For others, the theory was too fantastical to be taken seriously. Mainstream historians generally reject the royal conspiracy theory as fiction, but its persistence in books, documentaries, and films shows just how much the Ripper legend has become a vessel for storytelling, more than history. Still, not all cover-up theories focus on royalty. Some suggest that high-ranking members of the police or government knew who the Ripper was, but chose not to act. One of the darker theories involves the idea that the killer was a known informant, or even a police officer, whose arrest would have embarrassed the department. Another theory proposes that the real killer was part of a medical fraternity or private institution, and that colleagues protected him out of loyalty or fear of scandal. One particularly eerie detail that fuels these suspicions is how quickly some of the inquests were wrapped up. In some cases, officials discouraged the pursuit of certain lines of questioning. Were they simply trying to avoid panic, or was there more going on? We may never know. What's clear is that the lack of resolution in the case created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed all manner of ideas, some grounded in logic, others in paranoia. But if we set aside the theories for a moment, and return to the core facts, the story becomes no less haunting. 5 women murdered in brutal fashion, a killer who struck and vanished, a police force outmatched, a city terrified, and a legacy that refused to fade. By the end of 1889, the official Ripper case had largely gone cold. Investigators moved on to other duties. The press turned its attention to new scandals, and the East End of London, still battered and burdened, carried on as best it could. But for many people, then and now, the case never truly ended. It lingered, like fog on the Thames. In the next part, we'll look more closely at the lives of the victims, not just how they died, but how they lived. Their personal stories, so often overshadowed by the myth of the Ripper, deserve to be heard. They were more than names in a police file. They were daughters, mothers, friends. As we turn our attention to the victims of Jack the Ripper, it's important to remember something right away. These were real women with lives, stories, hopes and struggles, much more than the brief headlines and chilling crime scenes that history often reduces them to. Their lives were far from easy, living in the harsh realities of London's East End during the late 19th century, a place gripped by poverty, overcrowding, and despair. But despite these hardships, they were individuals, people trying to make the best of what they had. The 5 canonical victims we know are Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Each one's story adds layers to the tragedy, reminding us that behind the terror was a tapestry of human experience. Starting with Mary Ann Nichols, also known as Polly, by those who knew her. She was 43 years old when she was murdered in August of 1888. Polly's life was marked by struggle and loss, including periods of homelessness and addiction to alcohol, which was sadly common in impoverished areas of London at that time. She had been married and had children, but was estranged from her family by the time of her death. On the night she was killed, she had been seen drinking in pubs and wandering the streets. Despite her difficult circumstances, she had moments of kindness, and was remembered by some as a woman who cared for others in her own way. Next we have Annie Chapman. Annie was slightly older than Mary Ann, in her late 40s. She had a reputation as a hard-working woman, and was known to be friendly and talkative. Like many women in the area, she had fallen on hard times, and was reportedly involved in prostitution to survive. On the morning of September 8, 1888, her body was found in the backyard of a house on Hanbury Street. The brutality of the attack shocked many, but it was also a grim reminder of the vulnerability faced by women living on the margins. Annie's story is often overshadowed by the violence of her death, but she was a woman who had survived hardships with resilience. Elizabeth Stride, often referred to as Long Liz, was younger than the previous 2 victims, around 44 years old, and had a somewhat different background. She was said to be more reserved and quiet, often keeping to herself. Elizabeth worked as a cleaner, and had a history of heavy drinking. On September 30, 1888, her body was found in Duckfield's yard, off Berners Street. Notably, her throat was cut, but there was a lack of mutilation compared to the other victims, which has led some experts to suggest that the killer was interrupted or frightened off before completing his gruesome work. On that same night, just minutes later, the body of Catherine Eddowes was discovered in Mitre Square, located in the City of London, a short distance away. Catherine was 46 years old, and had been married twice. Like the others, she had struggled with poverty, and was known to have issues with alcohol. Catherine was reportedly a kind person, who sometimes took care of other people in the neighborhood. Her murder was one of the most violent, with severe mutilations that suggested a killer with anatomical knowledge. The fact that 2 victims were killed so close together in time and place added to the terror and confusion surrounding the case. Finally, there was Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest of the canonical 5, believed to be in her mid-20s. Mary Jane's life was perhaps the most tragic. She worked as a prostitute, like many women in Whitechapel, and struggled with addiction and abuse. However, she was also known to have a vibrant personality and a sharp mind. Mary Jane was found in her small room at 13 Miller's Court on November 9, 1888. The state of her body was horrific, far more mutilated than any of the others. This murder marked the final known killing attributed to Jack the Ripper. One thing that strikes anyone looking at these stories is the deep vulnerability these women faced every day. They lived in some of the poorest parts of London, where jobs were scarce, and dangers were many. Women who turned to prostitution often did so because it was one of the few ways to survive. but it also made them targets in a society that largely ignored their suffering. Police at the time seemed to view these women through a lens of moral judgment. They were called fallen women, and often received little sympathy. This attitude likely influenced the urgency and resources dedicated to finding their killer. Today we recognize how this victim-blaming perspective hindered the investigation and the broader societal understanding of the crimes. Despite their differences, all 5 women shared something fundamental: the tragic misfortune of crossing paths with a brutal killer. And yet the stories of their lives remind us that they were not defined by their deaths. Their names, their histories, their struggles, and their humanity remain important. One particularly poignant detail is how the local community reacted to these murders. There was fear, of course, but also a deep sadness. Many residents knew or had seen the women. They mourned quietly, often unable to express their grief openly in a harsh world. There are also records of local women banding together to protect one another as best they could, sharing news, warning each other about suspicious strangers, and trying to make their streets safer. It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was courage and care. The investigation itself faced many challenges, including the chaotic conditions of Whitechapel, the lack of modern forensic techniques, and the limitations of communication and policing in the 1880s. The police received many tips and complaints, but most turned out to be false leads or distractions. Witnesses were often unreliable, either because they were afraid to talk or confused by the events. The press sensationalized the case, sometimes spreading misinformation that complicated matters further. At the same time, the public's fascination with the murders helped to bring attention to the extreme poverty and social issues of the East End. Charities and reformers used the case to push for better housing, sanitation, and support for women. Looking back, it's clear that the victims' lives and deaths exposed painful truths about Victorian society, a world of stark contrasts between wealth and poverty, power and powerlessness, justice and neglect. By honoring their stories, we not only remember the victims, but also reflect on the human cost behind one of history's most infamous mysteries. As we step deeper into the story of Jack the Ripper, it's time to turn our attention to the police investigation. This was a time long before DNA testing, surveillance cameras, or even modern fingerprint analysis. The police had to rely on careful observation, witness testimony, and old-fashioned legwork in their search for the killer. But the conditions in London's East End made this an enormous challenge. The Metropolitan Police, commonly called the Met, was the main force handling the case. They were responsible for policing all of London, except the City of London itself, which had its own police force known as the City Police. Because some of the murders occurred inside the city limits, the City Police were also involved, and at times this caused confusion and difficulties in coordination. One of the earliest detectives assigned to the investigation was Inspector Frederick Abberlin, a man known for his steady demeanor and experience in handling difficult cases. Abberlin was a key figure, who oversaw much of the police work related to the Ripper murders. He had a reputation as a determined officer, though he faced immense pressure from the public, politicians, and the press to find the killer quickly. At the time, the police faced a daunting problem. The area where the murders happened was crowded, noisy, and filled with a constantly shifting population. Whitechapel was home to many immigrants, the poor, and those living on the edge of society. Streets were dark and narrow, and it was difficult to keep watch on every corner. The investigation began almost immediately after the first murder, that of Mary Ann Nichols. Police conducted door-to-door inquiries, spoke with witnesses, and tried to establish timelines. They gathered statements from people who had seen Nichols on the night of her death, but none provided a clear description of a suspect. The second murder, of Annie Chapman, intensified the pressure. The brutality of her death suggested a killer with a particular cruelty, and perhaps some medical knowledge. Detectives started considering the possibility that the murderer was a local man who knew the area well. This theory seemed to gain some support when they discovered a piece of an apron near Chapman's body that had been partially cut. The idea that the killer had a knife and could move swiftly in the dark streets started to take hold. Despite this, the police struggled to find firm leads. The neighborhood was filled with rumors and suspicion, but many residents were reluctant to speak openly to the authorities. Fear of retaliation and mistrust of the police were common, which made it hard to collect reliable information. To add to their challenges, the press played a double-edged role. Newspapers were eager for sensational stories, and the murders quickly became front-page news across London and beyond. While the coverage kept public attention on the case, it also led to a flood of letters and tips, some sincere, some hoaxes. One of the most famous examples was the so-called Dear Boss letter, received by the Central News Agency in London. The letter was signed Jack the Ripper, a name that instantly captured the public imagination. It described the murders in chilling detail, and threatened more violence to come. Whether this letter was truly from the killer remains debated by experts to this day, but the name stuck, becoming the grim moniker forever associated with the crimes. It also fueled a wave of fear and curiosity throughout the city. The police also received many other letters claiming to be from the killer, but most were dismissed as hoaxes or attempts to gain attention. The volume of communication overwhelmed detectives, and sometimes diverted resources from other lines of inquiry. Another major challenge was the lack of forensic technology. Crime scene investigation as we know it today was almost non-existent. Photographs were taken, but fingerprinting was still in its infancy, and not widely used by police. The idea of collecting blood samples or DNA was far in the future. Detectives had to rely on careful sketches, measurements, and eyewitness accounts. Unfortunately, these accounts were often contradictory or vague, making it difficult to piece together a clear picture of the suspect. One intriguing aspect of the investigation was the role of residents' patrols. Some local groups organized themselves to watch the streets at night, hoping to deter the killer or catch him in the act. These patrols sometimes worked alongside the police, but were generally informal and limited in their effectiveness. As the murders continued, tensions between the Metropolitan Police and the City Police became apparent. Each force had jurisdiction in different parts of London, and sometimes competed for control over the investigation. This rivalry added confusion and delays. Important evidence could be mishandled or overlooked, and communication gaps emerged. In a case where timing and details were crucial, these problems proved costly. Despite these obstacles, the police remained committed to finding the killer. They questioned hundreds of suspects over the months, ranging from local men with criminal records to those with suspicious behavior. Many were released after brief questioning, but a few were held longer. One suspect who attracted attention was a man named Montague John Druitt, a barrister and teacher, who mysteriously disappeared shortly after the final canonical murder. Some police officers believed he fit the profile of the killer, but no concrete evidence linked him to the crimes. Another person of interest was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant and hairdresser, who suffered from mental illness. Some witnesses reportedly identified him as suspicious, but again no definitive proof was ever found. Throughout the investigation, the police were under pressure to produce results. Public fear was high, and the murders had shaken confidence in law enforcement's ability to protect citizens. At times the authorities arrested and questioned men with little evidence, which led to criticism and claims of injustice. The social stigma around the victims, and the bias against immigrants and the poor, sometimes influenced police actions. Despite all efforts, the case remained unsolved. The killings abruptly stopped after Mary Jane Kelly's death, leaving many questions unanswered. Looking back, the police investigation into Jack the Ripper was a mixture of persistence, frustration, and tragedy. Limited by the technology and social conditions of the time, the officers did their best with the tools available. Their work would inspire future advances in criminal investigation, highlighting the need for better forensic science, community cooperation, and coordination among law enforcement agencies. As we reflect on these early police efforts, it's clear how difficult it was to catch a killer who operated in the shadows of one of the world's largest cities, at a time when modern crime-solving methods were still decades away.
Now that we've explored the police investigation and the difficulties they faced, it's time to turn our attention to some of the most intriguing suspects and theories that have emerged around the Jack the Ripper case. Over the decades, the mystery of the Ripper's identity has fascinated criminologists, historians, and amateur sleuths alike. This has led to a wide range of suspects proposed, each with their own stories, evidence, and controversies. One of the most well-known suspects is Montague John Druitt, whom we briefly mentioned earlier. Druitt was a barrister and schoolteacher who lived in London at the time of the murders. After the last canonical murder of Mary Jane Kelly in November 1888, Druitt disappeared and was later found drowned in the River Thames. Some police officials believed he was the Ripper, largely because of the timing of his disappearance, which coincided with the end of the killings. However, there was little concrete evidence linking Druitt to the crimes. His mental health had reportedly deteriorated before his death, which may have influenced suspicions, but no eyewitnesses placed him near the crime scenes. His family and friends maintained that he was not capable of such violence. Another often discussed suspect is Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant and hairdresser who lived in Whitechapel during the time of the murders. Kosminski suffered from severe mental illness and was later institutionalized. Some witnesses at the time reportedly identified him as suspicious, but these testimonies were often unreliable or conflicting. Kosminski's name has gained traction in more recent years due to claims that DNA evidence found on a shawl linked him to one of the victims. However, this evidence has been heavily debated and criticized for contamination and improper handling, so it remains inconclusive. Another figure who has appeared in many Ripper theories is Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born criminal and alleged lunatic who was imprisoned in 1888. Some historians have proposed Ostrog based on his violent past and presence in London, but there is little direct evidence to connect him to the murders. Some suspects came from more unexpected places. For example, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, grandson of Queen Victoria, has been implicated in various conspiracy theories. These theories suggest a royal cover-up to protect the prince, but historians generally dismiss these claims as lacking credible evidence. What stands out about many of these suspects is that the case has never had a definitive answer. The killer's identity remains one of history's greatest mysteries, in part because of the scant physical evidence and the limitations of investigative techniques of the time. Beyond individuals, some theories suggest the murders were committed by a group or that there was a wider conspiracy at play. These ideas often involve secret societies or police cover-ups, but they remain speculative without hard proof. The diversity of suspects and theories shows how much the story of Jack the Ripper captures the imagination. People are drawn to the puzzle, trying to piece together clues from incomplete records, conflicting witness statements, and the chilling details of the crimes. The mystery is also a reflection of the social conditions of the time: poverty, immigration, the role of women, and public fears. Each suspect offers a different lens through which to understand the case and the era. One thing that connects many of the suspects is their connection to the Whitechapel area and the impoverished communities living there. The killer had to know the streets well to move quickly and avoid detection, which makes locals like Kosminski or Druitt plausible candidates. But despite the many suspects, the case has never been solved definitively. The identity of Jack the Ripper remains a topic of endless fascination and speculation, keeping the story alive in popular culture and historical study. As we look closer at these suspects, we see the limits of the evidence, but also the enduring human desire to understand the unknown. Each theory adds a layer to the story, but none provide the final answer. Now, as we move deeper into the story, it's important to understand how the media played a significant role in shaping the public's perception of the Jack the Ripper murders. Newspapers of the late 19th century were rapidly growing in popularity, and their coverage of the murders was intense, sensational, and sometimes speculative. At the time, London's newspapers were competing fiercely for readers. Stories that evoked fear, mystery, and scandal sold papers. The gruesome nature of the Ripper murders provided perfect material for dramatic headlines and vivid descriptions. These articles didn't just report facts, they often aimed to captivate and terrify the public. From the first murder, newspapers published detailed accounts of the crimes, often embellishing or speculating on the killer's identity and motives. The descriptions of the victims and the violence inflicted upon them were explicit enough to shock, but were sometimes exaggerated to boost sales. One of the most infamous aspects of the media's involvement was the publication of letters allegedly written by the killer himself. These letters were sent to newspapers and police, taunting authorities and claiming responsibility for the murders. The most famous of these is the so-called Dear Boss letter, signed Jack the Ripper, which was received by the Central News Agency and then forwarded to Scotland Yard. This letter introduced the name Jack the Ripper to the world, a moniker that would become synonymous with terror and mystery. The name was catchy, ominous, and easily remembered, exactly the kind of branding that newspapers could exploit to sell more papers. Many scholars believe the Dear Boss letter, along with others like the Saucy Jackie postcard and the From Hell letter, were likely hoaxes. Yet the public and press took them seriously at the time, and the letters fueled both fear and fascination. The media didn't just report on the murders, it often influenced how people thought about the killer and the victims. The coverage shaped public fears about crime, poverty, and morality, especially in Whitechapel, an area already stigmatized for its overcrowding, prostitution, and poverty. The Ripper's crimes became a symbol of societal breakdown, with newspapers painting the East End as a dark, dangerous place full of depravity and danger. This portrayal affected how the public viewed the community and its inhabitants, often unfairly stereotyping them. Newspapers also stoked panic by emphasizing the killer's apparent ability to evade capture, which made the killer seem almost superhuman, adding to the aura of terror. This kind of sensationalism kept the story alive and in the headlines for months. However, the media's role was not without criticism. Some argued that the sensational reporting hampered the police investigation by creating hysteria and encouraging false leads. Others worried about the privacy and dignity of the victims and their families, who were often thrust into the public spotlight without consent. Interestingly, some police officials used the press strategically, leaking certain information or letters to shape public opinion or flush out the killer. The relationship between the police and media was complex and sometimes contentious. The media frenzy also led to what some call the Rippermania phenomenon, an obsession that lasted well beyond the murders themselves. This fascination has persisted for over a century, with books, films, documentaries, and tours keeping the story alive. The press coverage helped make Jack the Ripper one of the most infamous serial killers in history, but it also created a legend that sometimes obscures the reality of the victims and the social issues of the time. As we continue, we'll explore more about the victims themselves, their lives, backgrounds, and the social conditions they faced, helping us remember that behind the legend were real people whose stories deserve to be told. As we move forward, it's essential to focus on the victims of Jack the Ripper, often overshadowed by the mystery of the killer. The women who lost their lives deserve to be remembered as individuals with stories, struggles, and humanity. Understanding their backgrounds helps paint a fuller picture of the tragedy and the society in which these crimes occurred. The canonical 5 victims, widely accepted as those most certainly killed by Jack the Ripper, were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Each woman lived in poverty and faced the harsh realities of Victorian London's East End. Mary Ann Nichols, the first known victim, was 43 years old. Her life was marked by hardship and instability. She had been married, but the marriage ended, and she struggled with alcoholism and poverty. Like many women in Whitechapel at the time, she resorted to prostitution to survive. On the night she was murdered, she was seen drinking in local pubs before her death. Her body was discovered in Bucks Row, with the brutal wounds that would become all too familiar in this series. Annie Chapman was 47. She also lived a difficult life, including a failed marriage and periods of homelessness. On the day of her murder, she had been begging for food and money, a stark reminder of the desperation faced by many. Annie was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, her throat cut and body mutilated. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were both killed on the same night, September 30th, 1888, a night often called the double event. Elizabeth, sometimes known as Long Liz, was about 44 years old. She had a history of alcohol abuse and had been working as a prostitute to survive. Her murder was unusual in that her body was found with only her throat cut, without the mutilations seen in other cases, leading some to speculate the killer was interrupted.
Catherine Eddowes was 46 years old. Like the others, she had faced a hard life, involving poverty, illness, and time spent in workhouses. She was found within the City of London, her body mutilated in the same brutal fashion associated with the Ripper. Interestingly, a piece of her apron was found near another victim's crime scene, providing a rare physical link in the investigation. Mary Jane Kelly, the last canonical victim, was the youngest at about 25 years old. She was known as Pretty Mary Jane by locals. Unlike the others, she lived in a small rented room in Miller's Court. Her murder was the most gruesome and personal, with her body found mutilated beyond recognition, suggesting the killer had more time and privacy. Each victim was part of a community struggling with overcrowding, poor sanitation, and economic hardship. The East End was a place where many women turned to prostitution as a last resort. The work was dangerous and stigmatized, but for some it was a way to survive in a harsh environment. Their stories highlight a grim reality, that poverty, lack of social support, and the harshness of Victorian society left many vulnerable. These women's deaths sparked outrage and fear, but also brought attention to the social issues of the time. Families and friends mourned deeply, and the community was gripped with terror. However, the official response to their deaths was complicated by class and social attitudes. Often, victims of prostitution were marginalized in society, and sometimes even in the eyes of law enforcement. The police investigation focused on finding the murderer, but there was also an undercurrent of judgment toward the victims. This reflected wider societal prejudices, where poor women were seen as morally weak or responsible for their own fate. Despite these attitudes, the victims were real people with hopes, fears, and struggles. Their stories remind us that behind the sensational headlines and mystery lies a human tragedy. Understanding their lives helps us approach the story of Jack the Ripper with more empathy and depth. It also encourages us to consider the broader social conditions that allowed such horrors to occur. As we continue, we will explore the police investigation itself, how officers worked to solve the case, the challenges they faced, and the leads they followed. Now, let's delve into the police investigation that followed these grisly murders, an effort that was both unprecedented and plagued with frustration. The police at the time faced immense pressure from the public and the government to catch the perpetrator quickly. Yet they were limited by the forensic and investigative techniques available in the late 19th century, which were far less advanced than what we have today. The Metropolitan Police, commonly called Scotland Yard, took the lead in the investigation. The East End was under the jurisdiction of the Metropolitan Police, and their Detective Chief Inspector, Frederick Aberline, became a central figure in the case. Aberline was experienced and respected, but had never faced anything quite like the Ripper murders. The investigation began with the discovery of Mary Ann Nichols's body in August 1888. Detectives worked quickly to interview witnesses and collect evidence, though at the time crime scene management was not as rigorous as it is now. Photographs of the crime scenes were taken, which was a relatively new practice, and sketches of suspects were circulated in newspapers. As the murders continued, pressure mounted. Each killing was more brutal than the last, and fear gripped London's East End. Residents were terrified to be out at night, and businesses closed earlier. The media frenzy around the case helped fuel the panic, but also kept public interest and pressure on the police. One of the challenges the police faced was the vast number of suspects. Hundreds of men were questioned, many of whom were known criminals or locals with violent tendencies. Some were quickly ruled out, while others remained persons of interest for months. One early suspect was a man named Montague John Druitt, a barrister and school teacher, who disappeared shortly after the last canonical murder. His body was later found in the Thames River, leading some to speculate he had taken his own life out of guilt. However, no concrete evidence connected him to the crimes. Another suspect was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant and known lunatic, who was committed to an asylum. Some police officials at the time privately believed Kosminski was the Ripper, but there was never sufficient evidence to arrest or charge him. The police also looked into a man named Michael Ostrog, a Russian criminal with a history of violent behavior, but again there was little to link him to the murders conclusively. One of the biggest problems was the lack of modern forensic tools. There was no DNA analysis, no fingerprints lifted from the scenes, and very limited scientific understanding of how to trace and identify suspects based on physical evidence. The police relied heavily on eyewitness accounts, which were often unreliable, and the patterns they could observe in the murders. In addition to the suspects, the investigation was complicated by the media. Newspapers were competing for sensational stories, sometimes publishing false or exaggerated information. At times, letters claiming to be from the killer were sent to newspapers and police. The most infamous of these was the Dear Boss letter, signed Jack the Ripper, which named the killer, and was the source of his now famous nickname. Some believed this letter was a hoax, but it added to the mythos surrounding the case. The police also received numerous tips and confessions, but few could be verified. The sheer volume of information made it difficult to focus on credible leads. The public was divided in opinion. Some thought the police were ineffective or corrupt, while others believed the killer was a skilled, intelligent man who knew how to evade capture. The social climate of the time also played a role in the investigation's difficulty. The East End was a densely populated area, with many residents suspicious of police and outsiders. This made gathering reliable witness testimony a challenge. Despite these challenges, the police remained determined. They increased patrols in the affected areas and tried to reassure the public. Unfortunately, the killer seemed to strike with impunity, and the case began to grow colder with time. As we continue, we will look at some of the most notable suspects and theories that have emerged over the years, from the contemporary police leads to the more modern speculative ideas. The mystery of Jack the Ripper's identity has fascinated generations, and the variety of suspects and theories reflect that enduring intrigue. As the investigation dragged on with little progress, various theories about the killer's identity began to take shape. Some of these theories came from official police speculation, while others were fueled by journalists, authors, and amateur detectives. Over the years, these ideas have multiplied, turning the Jack the Ripper case into one of the most studied mysteries in true crime history. One of the earliest and most persistent theories centers on the idea that Jack the Ripper was someone with anatomical knowledge, possibly a doctor, surgeon, or butcher. This theory arose because of the precise nature of the mutilations on the victims, which suggested that the killer understood the human body and knew exactly where to cut. Some of the victims had organs removed with disturbing accuracy, leading many to believe the killer had medical training. At the time, several doctors and surgeons in London were questioned, but none were officially charged. However, this medical theory persisted and became a popular angle for writers and investigators. Some suspects were indeed medical professionals, while others were people who worked in butcheries or slaughterhouses, and might have had the skills to carry out such gruesome acts. Another theory points to the possibility that the killer was a member of the royal family, or someone connected to high society. This idea is more speculative, and based largely on conspiracy theories, rather than hard evidence. According to this theory, the murders were covered up by powerful individuals who wanted to protect the reputation of the royal family, or other elite groups. There were rumors and wild claims about secret love affairs and scandals, but no credible proof ever emerged. Among the suspects who have been proposed over the years are several well-known names, some more plausible than others. One suspect who has gained renewed attention in recent years is Walter Sickert, a British painter known for his dark, moody works. Some researchers have argued that Sickert's paintings and writings hint at knowledge of the murders, and even suggest that he was the killer. However, most experts consider this theory unlikely, and see it as part of the sensationalism that has grown around the case. Another suspect, Aaron Kosminski, whom we mentioned earlier, remains a compelling figure. He was a Polish immigrant who had a history of mental illness and violent tendencies. Some modern forensic investigations have attempted to link DNA from a shawl found at one of the crime scenes to Kosminski, but the evidence remains controversial and disputed by many experts. The investigation was also hindered by the police's own internal issues. Rivalries between police forces and mistakes in handling evidence led to lost opportunities. Some officers were reportedly overconfident, while others were overwhelmed by the scale of the case. The pressure to solve the murders quickly meant that some leads were followed up hastily, or ignored altogether. Letters and messages claiming to be from the killer added another layer of complexity. Many of these were hoaxes, but a few contained details only the true killer would know. The most famous, the Dear Boss letter, was the first to use the name Jack the Ripper, and was followed by several other letters signed with the same name. Whether these letters were genuine remains a subject of debate. The public's fascination with the Ripper murders only grew as the years passed. Books, films, and documentaries have explored every angle imaginable. The mystery has inspired countless theories, from the plausible to the outlandish, including ideas involving Freemasons, aliens, and secret societies. The true identity of Jack the Ripper remains unknown, but the impact of the case on policing, media, and public consciousness is undeniable. It changed how crimes were investigated, how the media covered sensational stories, and how society viewed violence and fear. In the next part, we will explore some of the specific suspects in more detail, examining the evidence for and against them. We will look at the lives of these men, their connections to the case, and how modern research has shed light on their possible involvement. Among the many suspects in the Jack the Ripper case, some stand out more prominently due to their backgrounds, behaviors, or the evidence that linked them, however tenuously, to the crimes. As we dive deeper into these individuals, it's important to remember that none were ever formally charged or convicted, and that the true killer has never been definitively identified. One of the most notorious suspects is Aaron Kosminski, the Polish immigrant mentioned earlier. Kosminski was a resident of Whitechapel, the very area where the murders took place, and he was known to have suffered from severe mental illness. Contemporary police records indicate that he was considered a prime suspect by some officers at the time. Kosminski was reportedly institutionalized later in life, spending many years in mental hospitals until his death. Modern forensic analysis has attempted to link Kosminski to the murders through DNA evidence. In the early 2000s, a shawl found at the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder was tested, and some claimed that mitochondrial DNA on the shawl matched descendants of Kosminski's. However, the reliability of this evidence is widely debated. The shawl's provenance is unclear, and contamination over the decades is a serious concern. Most experts caution against drawing firm conclusions from this. Despite the controversy, Kosminski's profile fits several elements of the case. He lived in the area, had a history of violent tendencies and mental instability, and disappeared from public life around the time the murders stopped. But the absence of solid proof means he remains a suspect, not a confirmed culprit. Another suspect who captured public attention was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and school teacher. Druitt's name surfaced shortly after the last known murder in 1888. He was said to have committed suicide shortly after the final killing, leading some to speculate that guilt drove him to take his own life. Druitt was known to have had psychological issues, but concrete evidence tying him to the crimes is scarce. In the police records, Druitt was mentioned as a suspect by certain officials, but the case against him was never strong. There were no eyewitnesses or physical evidence linking him to the murders. His death shortly after the killings ended seemed suspicious to some, but could just as easily have been a tragic coincidence. A third notable suspect was John Pizer, a local bootmaker nicknamed Leather Apron. Pizer was briefly arrested and questioned due to his nickname and reputation for being rough with women. However, he had an alibi for at least some of the murders, and was quickly released. His case highlights the dangers of jumping to conclusions based on hearsay and prejudice. Then there was the intriguing case of Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born conman and thief with a history of violent behavior. He was imprisoned multiple times, and was considered dangerous. Some police files list him as a suspect, but his known whereabouts during the murders do not fully align with the times of the killings, making it unlikely he was the Ripper. Moving away from these earlier suspects, the list also includes some more unusual candidates. For example, Some theories implicate Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor and possible misogynist, who was in London at the time. Tumblety was arrested on unrelated charges, but fled the country before he could be questioned thoroughly about the murders. His aggressive behavior and presence in London have led some to believe he could have been involved. Additionally, some have speculated about a connection to Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, a member of the British royal family. This theory suggests that the prince had some involvement in the murders, or that the crimes were covered up to protect him. These ideas are largely based on rumor, with no credible evidence backing them, but they have captured the imagination of conspiracy theorists for over a century. What all these suspects share, however, is the lack of definitive proof. No fingerprints, no reliable eyewitness testimony, no clear motive, all of which made the case nearly impossible to solve, especially with the forensic technology of the time. The public's obsession with finding the Ripper's identity has also complicated the investigation's legacy. The flood of letters, some genuine, many hoaxes, only added noise. Newspaper sensationalism amplified fear and speculation, sometimes clouding facts. This combination of mystery and myth turned Jack the Ripper into a legend, making it difficult for investigators and historians to separate truth from fiction. In addition to suspects, the victims themselves have been the focus of considerable study. Understanding their lives sheds light on the social conditions that made such crimes possible. Most of the victims were impoverished women struggling in the harsh realities of Victorian London's East End. Many faced daily dangers beyond the threat of violence, including extreme poverty, homelessness, and social stigma. The harsh living conditions and lack of social support systems contributed to their vulnerability. The police and society at large often overlooked or dismissed the plights of these women, focusing instead on the sensational nature of the murders. This context reminds us that the victims were more than just names in a murder case. They were human beings with stories and struggles. Looking back, the Jack the Ripper case has taught law enforcement valuable lessons about crime scene management, forensic science, and community policing. The lack of coordination and communication among police forces, the failure to preserve evidence, and the early mistakes in investigating the murders highlighted areas in need of improvement. Over time, advances in forensic technology, such as fingerprinting and DNA analysis, have revolutionized crime solving. While these tools weren't available in the 1880s, modern researchers continue to apply new methods in hopes of finally uncovering the killer's identity. The fascination with Jack the Ripper is not just about the crimes themselves, but also about what the case reveals regarding human nature, fear, and society's response to tragedy. It is a story about mystery, horror, and the search for justice, told across more than a century. In our final part, we will reflect on the enduring legacy of Jack the Ripper, the impact on culture, law enforcement, and how this unsolved mystery continues to captivate and haunt us to this day.
As we near the conclusion of our journey through the dark and mysterious world of Jack the Ripper, it's important to pause and consider the lasting impact this case has had, far beyond the foggy streets of Victorian London. Jack the Ripper's murders took place over just a few months in 1888, but their legacy has endured for well over a century. The mystery of his identity, the brutality of the crimes, and the societal backdrop have combined to create one of the most famous and chilling true crime stories in history. This case has influenced countless books, films, documentaries, and even music, becoming a permanent fixture in popular culture. The figure of Jack the Ripper embodies not only the horror of the murders, but also the fear of the unknown and the darker side of human nature. From gritty detective novels to modern crime dramas, the Ripper legend continues to inspire and terrify audiences worldwide. The story's resonance comes partly from its timeless themes: the vulnerability of marginalized individuals, the failure of institutions to protect the vulnerable, and the enduring quest for justice in the face of incomplete information. One of the most significant impacts of the case was on policing and forensic science. The inability to catch the killer, despite a massive police effort, underscored the need for better investigative methods. This tragedy helped to spur developments such as improved crime scene protocols, fingerprinting, and later DNA analysis, all essential tools in modern detective work. The public's obsession with Jack the Ripper also helped shape how true crime stories are told and consumed. The sensational media coverage in 1888 set a precedent for how newspapers could capture the public's imagination, sometimes at the cost of accuracy and sensitivity. This balance between reporting facts and feeding sensationalism is a tension still seen in true crime media today. Another key legacy is the way the case has prompted ongoing discussion about social justice. The victims were poor women living in harsh conditions, largely ignored by polite society and the authorities. Their murders highlighted the need to address the deep social inequalities and systemic failures that allowed such tragedies to happen. Beyond this, the Ripper case has encouraged generations of amateur sleuths and professional criminologists alike to study the evidence, re-examine theories, and search for new clues. The enduring fascination shows how people are drawn to puzzles, especially those with dark, unresolved corners. It's worth reflecting on the victims themselves, whose stories are sometimes overshadowed by the killer's notoriety. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly were real people with families, dreams, and hardships. Remembering their humanity helps us honor their memory beyond the sensational headlines. Their tragic deaths serve as a reminder of the importance of compassion and justice, not only in history, but in how we approach crime and vulnerability today. Even as the years pass, the Jack the Ripper case reminds us how mysteries can endure and evolve. New theories emerge, new evidence is analyzed, and interest in the story remains vibrant. It is a puzzle that resists final closure, holding a mirror to the complexities of crime, society, and human psychology. As we close this story, it's natural to feel a mixture of fascination, sadness, and curiosity. The Ripper's true identity may never be known, but his crimes and the questions they raise continue to echo across time. Perhaps this is why the story endures, not just because of the terror it caused, but because it challenges us to seek understanding in a world that often defies easy answers. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadowy world of Jack the Ripper. I hope this calm and detailed exploration has given you both insight and a peaceful space to reflect on one of history's most enduring mysteries. As we come to the close of our exploration into the dark and chilling saga of Jack the Ripper, it is important to pause and reflect not only on the crimes themselves, but on the legacy they left behind, a legacy that continues to captivate and puzzle us to this day. Throughout this series, we've traveled back to the gaslit streets of Victorian London, walked through the grim alleys of Whitechapel, and examined the lives and tragic ends of the 5 canonical victims. We've delved into the investigations, the suspects, and the many theories that have swirled around this case for more than a century. And yet, despite all the study and speculation, the true identity of Jack the Ripper remains a mystery, an enigma wrapped in the fog and shadows of the past. This unresolved mystery is part of what keeps the story alive. The unknown invites us in, encourages us to imagine, to analyze, and to wonder. It reminds us that history is not just a collection of facts, but a tapestry of stories that often resist easy answers. More importantly, the story of Jack the Ripper is a window into the social realities of Victorian London, the poverty, the neglect, and the vulnerable lives lived on society's margins. It is a sobering reminder of the consequences when injustice and inequality go unaddressed. The victims, women who lived difficult lives in difficult times, were more than just names or headlines. They were people, complex, real, deserving of dignity and remembrance. Their stories urge us to look beyond the sensationalism and to honor their humanity. For modern audiences, the case is also a lesson in the evolution of policing and forensic science. The challenges faced by investigators in 1888 sparked important advances that have transformed how crime is solved today. It also shows us the limits of technology and knowledge, and the persistence of human fallibility. As we close this chapter on Jack the Ripper, it's natural to feel a mix of emotions: curiosity, sadness, even relief that the terror ended, but also perhaps a cautious hope. A hope that by studying and remembering such stories, we can better understand the past and build a more just future. In a way, the Ripper's story is a reminder that some mysteries will always linger. Some questions may never be answered, and some darkness may never be fully illuminated. But the search for truth, patient, careful, and compassionate, is itself a light. Thank you for joining me on this calm and thoughtful journey. I hope that this exploration has not only informed you but offered a peaceful space to ponder a haunting piece of history. Whether you came to study, to relax, or simply to satisfy a quiet curiosity, your time here is appreciated. If you enjoyed this story, consider revisiting it whenever you want to reflect on the complexities of human nature and the shadows of history. Until next time, take care and may your nights be calm and your questions thoughtful.